Alright guys, we've done Garbage Deck Activate, now it's time for something a little bit different. This is my Deck Doctor series, so every week I'm going to make a tweet like this, basically saying, whoever, comments on this, I'm going to be looking through all the lists, and I'll pick one, sometimes that somewhat randomly, and basically we are going to break it down. Usually I'm going to pick a concept that I find kind of interesting or something that, isn't already necessarily solved. This week, we've got iRequiem X, who is basically saying that he's got a nuts unkillable Fizz with Targon deck. And you know what? I'm actually kind of interested in the idea of Fizz with Targon, so let's go ahead and take a look at this. So we're just going to go ahead and start with initial impressions. I'm going to start by playing a game without making any changes, and then I'm going to make a couple of changes as I go. Total playing 3 games with this deck, trying to make it better every single time, and talk about the deck building theory and the changes I make. So we're starting off kind of like an interesting build here. We've got, obviously the Fizz, we've got a lot of, buffs for him, the Gift Giver, etc. Some supplemental elusives, I like the idea of that. Giddy Sparkeologist. Spell Shields is probably a little bit redundant with Fizz, we'll see how that works out. And a double attack on Citrus Courier. So a lot of the kinds of things you'd expect from a Fizz Targon deck. Alright, we're just going to go ahead and jump into a game with this deck. I can actually go ahead and take this to ranked ladder, honestly. I'm currently just at, the bottom of Masters, so it's not going to make too much of a difference. And to be perfectly honest, I don't think this concept is necessarily, super non-competitive or memey. I think it'll actually have a pretty decent chance. If it's, well refined, we're going to make some edits as we go. And I think it shouldn't be too hard, beating down on the Masters ladder with this. We had Ezreal TF right off the bat, which is actually a pretty good matchup. Now, one of the awkwardnesses with this deck is the ability to find our Fizz is going to be hampered. A lot of the cases are probably going to need written in the stars to find it. Either way, I'm going to have to mulligan super deep looking for my Fizz here. There it is. Well, that was not so hard. So as you're getting any sort of 3 of that you're looking for, within the opening periods of the game, it's 60%, so it's not terrible, but we're gonna want to see if we can boost those odds. So yeah, we can go ahead and play Fizz out early. We're not gonna block the Butcher, but we'd like to have it out on turn 1 anyway. And since he's got no threats at 0, there's not really any big downside to this. Here we are just gonna have to slow play our Fizz. We do need to make sure we're keeping spells to keep it alive, and that's fine. Basically, the idea here is we're just going to try to race him down. Immediately, we see stuff like Bastion that I don't really love. I think this deck has too much spell shields in it. I really want to have the idea to, try to not be redundant with Fizz in that way. I want just tutors, buffs, whereas spell shields kind of doesn't really go that well with his effect already. Okay, so bit of an awkward start. They've got a really aggressive start, and we want to make sure we're not getting blown out or anything crazy. So I'm going to go ahead and Behold the Infinite and see if we can get something decent. I really like the idea of the Trickster here. I think this will help race him down pretty well. Okay, let's go ahead and play our Trickster. So this one's pretty interesting. It says TF, so we are going to have the ability to, basically try to block this out. Unfortunately, the one downside of trying to survive here is we did have to tap to 0 with our Fizz, and if they have Parlay, they might just blow him up here, or they might be a little bit afraid of a warning shot. I think the best thing to do is to just take a mild block with the Trickster. I actually want to keep this above 1 health here. We just want the ability to basically race down without actually dying off of our units. And while we're out of mana, I really don't like playing the Trickster. So something that this deck is also going to really need is Nightfall enablers here, man. We're going to get a lot of these Nightfall cards in hand, and there's not a good enough amount of enablers to these, right? There's no spell I really want to be pre-playing here, and we can't even open with Shadestalker. So definitely looking a little awkward already. I think I can open with Guiding Touch. This is probably the most reasonable play. I mean, everything else just feels just way too awkward. So I'm going to have to take this attack here. We can't really spend all of our mana because we do need, ways of protecting our stuff. So he basically has to let this happen, which is good for me. But the one issue with it is that, we are going to have to tap out to play, all of our cards. We can't play fully reactively because otherwise we will end up getting raced down. For example, if I play the Shadestalker, he will have an opportunity to kill my Trickster or my Fizz without responsibility. Let's go ahead and pass here. We do have the Otter, which can block Ezreal, which is nice, but it's going to be really, really awkward. When he open attacks every turn, because I have such a Nightfall heavy hand, we might just get raced down without the ability to do too much here. So, yeah, Bastion's really breaking out. Citrus Courier's really not feeling so well as well. We can go ahead and take like a Blessing of Targon, but it looks like the race potential here is going to be real. Let's try one Blessing of Targon on the Fizz here. We do have the second spell, so it should be alright just going on the Fizz. Let's keep his health a little bit higher. We can go down to 8 here. It's a little bit dicey, but we might be able to power down really, really quickly with a Citrus Courier as well. Another issue here is that Citrus Courier is actually clunky with the Nightfalls too. The problem is you want to be playing the Courier like at the end of your turn, but that's also the timing you want to be playing Nightfalls, right? You can't really open with Courier into Nightfall, so it's always going to have kind of like, it almost has the same exact text as a Nightfall, really. Okay, so it's a much better hand here, and Zenith Blade is actually kind of hilarious because his Ezreal being like an elusive blocker is a lot less valuable for him here, right? And we can go ahead and Zenith on Fizz, and it's going to be really, really hard for him to disrupt this, because if he tries to like blow up our Fizz with anything, we can always take off the targeting. So right off the bat, Zenith, I really like the potential of. It's a 2 of in the list currently. I could actually maybe even see bumping it to a 3 of, which is really crazy. Okay, so we just want to make sure, you know, we have enough triggers to keep things alive in every way they need to. We have a decent attack right here. He does have the ability to let this through more than I would like. We could go for one Shadestalker. This would tap us down and we'd only have one Pale Cascade. I think at this point we can just take this attack here. I actually have no problem playing the Shadestalker after combat because we're not really threatening any sort of like major damage range here anyway. So we can go ahead and just Pale Cascade this. Just want to keep it as a reasonable threat for the Ezreal. You expect to see something like a second Mystic Shot, but the nice thing about here is Make It Rain will get entirely fizzled if it was Make It Rain. So we can go for the Bastion here. This would tap us out, and it would give him the ability to try to counter the Fizz. That would be something like a Thermo Beam. But because we have second Fizz and second Zenith Blade, I think I would actually be okay if he went in with a Thermo Beam on the Fizz if the Ezreal died here. So let's go ahead and Bastion up the Otter, and the Fizz is going to level off of this, allowing him to smack face for 7. Now, the cool thing about this is that it will probably die to a Thermo. Ooh, interesting. So the Make It Rain comes out here, and this is going to basically threaten out the Ezreal. Unfortunately, we don't have the 0 mana card Warning Shot to be able to counter Make It Rain. Warning Shot would have been an absolutely huge blowout there, because we would have been able to fizzle the entire Make It Rain effect. Okay, and he's got the Thermo on the Fizz, sending the Fizz to 1. Fizz does have Overwhelm, so hilariously enough, we could actually still be good against a lot of these effects. Going down to 1 here, so we probably have no choice but to open with a Cascade on a Fizz. A hand full of like low spell utility here. This is really, really awkward. I think I can definitely patch this deck up in a major way, because it should be extremely rare that we hit a hand where we only have one fast spell, and the fact that this is Nightfall at that is really, really, really clunky. So I already have a pretty good idea of like where I want to take this deck to make it better. So we have very few ways of surviving this. It looks like our only chance is to block the Ezreal, and then basically hope that he doesn't have a Mystic Shot from hand. We're already getting like quite punished from pretty much any spell actually does have the ability to just kill our Fizz here. It's a little hard for him to go in for a spell, but... Okay, so in all likelihood, we should be dead here. Ooh, yeah, red card kills off our Fizz. And we're at 1 health, so we're dead to like a Make It Rain or a Static Shock. We can go ahead and play the other Fizz here. So he might have a Make It Rain. Hilariously enough, we actually can't stop it. Yep, there's the Warning Shot, and we're dead. All right, so let's go ahead and go back to the builder and improve this deck. I actually like the core concepts. I think a refined version of this deck should absolutely have won a game like that. Ezreal TF should be a very, very favored matchup for a Fizz deck. All right, let's fix this up. All right, so the first thing I want to change about this deck is getting out some of these kind of like slow and clunky spells. In particular, the spell shields are really redundant with how Fizz works. I think the original idea was probably to counter stuff at burst speed like Hush or Harsh Winds, but to be honest, I don't think it's enough. Just those couple of cards aren't really enough to merit going into spell shield when Fizz himself counters every single other thing except for just those effects. So it's not going to be quite worth it being in spell shields. I also like the idea of starting off with some of the Targon staples, in particular Spacey Sketcher as well as Lunari Duskbringer are going to be a really good replacement to the early drop of Gift Giver. Gift Giver is basically, you know, summons a gem in hand, but the biggest problem with gem is because you can't cast it in combat or response to a spell, it becomes a little bit awkward with Fizz in some cases, right? I also think that's something really important to the early performance of Targon decks as a whole is actually this card here, Spacey Sketcher. Spacey Sketcher is straight up one of the best cards in the game. This is an incredibly difficult to use card, and I'll go into, this is probably the highest skill ceiling card in the entire game, actually. I can't think of anything even close to it. There's a lot I can go into about it, but basically just having to discard early and having to like make sure you choose the right card against like the proper matchup. There's a ton that goes into this, but its sheer flexibility is going to be wonderful in this deck. Being able to have like the Snake Challenger against that elusive chump blocker is going to be really nice sometimes. Spell enablers, you name it, Spacey Sketcher gets it. Then our next problem is going to be consistency. So this deck, we got a little bit lucky and drew the Fizz, but you know, we only have like a 60% chance of drawing it by, you know, a reasonably early turn. Not good considering this deck basically can't win without it. And we do have a chance at getting Written in the Stars, which is great, especially because Solari Priestess has great odds of giving it, but we're not always going to be able to get Solari Priestess or Written in the Stars either, and we're losing too many games off of not drawing Fizz. So what I'd like to do is replace some of our late game potential cards, those being Citrus Courier and Blessing of Targon, the very expensive cards that are actually just not doing as much for us, and get a little bit of extra draw power in here. I like starting off with personally 2 Salvages and 2 Pick a Card in a Fizz style deck. I find that Pick a Card is a really good kind of like finisher. It can be a decent job of, you know, setting up the Nightfall sort of stuff as well in the sort of like late positions. Okay, so I think this should be a pretty good start to, like, you know, it is a first iteration to improve the deck. It's looking a lot cleaner now. I'm personally still a little bit hesitant about, for example, like 3 Behold the Infinite. Obviously, the idea is to get Written in the Stars, you know, at any cost, but we'll see if it's just, you know, enough value. So let's go ahead and take it out for another game. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get into our next game. This one's going to be against an Aesol Trundle ramp. This one's quite interesting. They have a lot of spells that, you know, basically AoE target instead of, you know, interacting with Fizz in any way, and he's not going to be able to dodge those, which could be a bit of an issue. Let's go ahead and look at our hand and think how we want to mulligan this. I think a really good idea is to basically just go as aggressively as possible to find the Fizz, because that's just too much of our game plan. So as tempting as it is to keep Spacey Sketcher or Gift Giver, you're probably going to have, like, you know, one of them if you don't find the Fizz later anyway, so it's not that big of a deal to keep them. In this case, there's just no reason to Sketcher on turn 1, so it's perfectly fine just chilling here. Alright, so we do have the Solari Priestess, which has a 50-50 chance of giving Written in the Stars, because there's 6 options and it shows you 3. So our Fizz is likely going to be swinging in his first attack turn on 4, which means that if we play Solari Priestess on 3 with Written in the Stars into Fizz, costing a grand total of 4 mana on turn 4, we can have a total of 3 banked if we bank 3 going into the Priestess. Which means in an ideal world we'd play the Mentor into that, which means we just don't have any mana to spare actually, which is really interesting. We actually can't play anything here because we want to play Priestess, Mentor, Written in the Stars, Fizz, all on turn 4 if we get the Written in the Stars off of this. So let's go ahead and see what we get off of Priestess first. And we did whiff the Written in the Stars. We did get the Traveler, and this can give us somewhat of another chance. I'm a little hesitant to take this because at this point in time, you know, this is not as likely to actually hit anything as impactfully, whereas Fallen Comet can actually clean up his game plan quite a bit. We could actually want to go into the Sisters. Let's take the Traveler, though. I think that this deck is actually just, unfortunately, with this hand, too committed to this strategy to even be able to escape it. Okay. So we have the Traveler. We don't have the ability to play Written in the Stars. We can try to go for a Behold the Infinite and see if it, potentially works out. It's going to have the ability to curve into Written if we find it. Let's start with Behold and see what happens. We have pretty low chances of finding Written. So here's Moonsilver and the Golden Sister. Okay, that's pretty interesting. Let's take the Golden Sister here. This is one card that actually has a chance of giving us great value, even though it kind of like deviates from our main plan. So the one problem with here is like Mentor doesn't really have a great buff target, and like buffing the Snake with Mentor into this kind of board where they have a lot of AoE isn't really as valuable either. We're just going to go ahead and keep invoking and basically go all in on this game plan, hoping that it works out. In this case, I think Equinox is going to be very powerful here. The ability to stun 2 followers against his deck is actually not as valuable, whereas we already have the ability to make him effectively discard a card by silencing an Ever-Risen Sentry. Okay, so pretty unfortunate draw already, but the nice thing about this deck is even when you draw Fizz late, if you get him off with a combo and you're able to buff him up and, kind of like stall out with your blocks, you're actually usually in a pretty good shape for the opponent to not really have a great response to that. Okay, so we can just go ahead and silence one of the sentries, make an easy kill here. Okay. He's going to go ahead and get a free hit in with Trundle, which I'm totally fine with. That's actually like a very, very passive attack. I was more afraid that he would attack with more of his units here. So we do have the ability to, develop out Mentor in preparation. We've got Sketcher as well. I think I'm going to use Sketcher a little bit more reactively here. Let's Mentor first and see what our draw gives us. We can combine the Mentor with the Elusive on the, the Silver Sister. That would work perfectly fine because we do have the ability to curve out Silver Sister next turn. And if he goes in and tries to do an Ice Quake, which is fairly common, we can do a lot of damage with Pale Cascade and just try to win with the Elusive when conditioned. Because keep in mind, we do have an Elusive here. It's not an untargetable Elusive, but in this matchup, it actually doesn't really matter that much that it is untargetable. So I'm pretty happy playing out the Silver Sister here. We expect an Ice Quake, and we've got the great response of Pale Cascade if that were to happen. Okay. So at this point, we can go ahead and, start taking, the big buff, right? The Elusive can get in with Mentor, and it might be a little bit hard for him to deal with it long term if we keep buffing this more and more, because we've got another Mentor that's also going to be giving more buffs, as well as a bunch of gems. Okay. We're going to have to deal a metric shit ton of damage here, though, because, of course, his deck runs a lot of heals. But as long as he doesn't find any, like, elusive blockers off of his invokes, it actually might not matter that much how much healing he has. The elusive blockers are a lot scarier to me than the healing. We might be able to punch through with Hush, though. Okay, so the one thing about the situation is we've got a 10-card hand, which means we are going to have to play a card here if we want to be able to draw. I'm pretty happy just taking Gem on the elusive here as a nice passive play. Another thing about an elusive blocker is we don't only have Hush, we could also get the Snake off of the Spacey Sketcher to drag away an elusive blocker. Okay, Cosmic Inspiration. This is actually really, really amazing for me because my only objective is to basically try to get it in really, really big with elusive that doesn't get blocked. And the Cosmic Inspiration actually doesn't represent too much of a threat here, oddly enough. We could try to Sketcher. We don't really have the ability to block with Mentor because our hand is far too full of gems. And I don't think I'm actually too afraid of, overcommitting into the Golden Sister. So I'm pretty happy pre-gemming into Golden Sister and then going in for something like a Spacey Sketcher. The one awkward thing is, what we're actually getting rid of with the Spacey Sketcher. I think that our best play is to just go in really, really big with the gems and actually try to do some kind of like one-turn combo. His deck doesn't run a big hard removal, right? And because his deck doesn't run big hard removal, it's actually surprisingly hard for him to punish us just buffing this unit over and over and over again. We can go ahead and, in this case, kick the Behold. It's actually probably not going to be as useful here. The main reason it's in this deck is to find the Fizz, but it looks like we're committing ourselves out of the Fizz game plan. Okay, we've got Moonglow for Spell Shields. I think we actually need to be able to survive a few more attacks, so I think I have to take the Crescent Strike instead, unfortunately. As much as I'd love the Spell Shield here, being able to stun two things is just too valuable in terms of, slowing this game down and making sure we stay alive, as we can see here. Okay, and the Golden Sister is going to heal us up a little bit. So he's overhealing with Catalyst, which is great for us. I mean, we're not that far off of being able to literally one-shot him with the Silver Sister. Although, yeah, we won't be able to one-shot him. So he should take a bit of an attack here. It's not a great attack. We'd have blockers. Interesting. He actually doesn't take an attack at all. I think he probably had a couple of attacks there that he missed out on. Okay. So, you know, this situation's pretty unique. We can actually Fizz here, and the cool thing is he can't really AoE this board because he has such board ownership. Something like an Ice Quake doesn't really make that much sense for him to use. So our Fizz is already leveled, so it's already got 3 attack, which means we have a truly terrifying 12 elusive damage on board already, and we've got 9 mana to pump even more. So depending on what he does, he could actually find himself basically dying this action. So this is very, very interesting. We've got 9 mana and we're missing 8 damage, right? We've got a couple of Pale Cascades that's going to be even ratios, and we've got Pocket Aces and Mentor that are basically down on ratio and unable to represent quite as much value, right? So we want to try to get it to the point where we have the chance to one-shot him. Let's open with a Pale Cascade first and just see what we end up drawing from it. Guiding Touch isn't really going to help our lethal condition here. Normally, we're not like all in on trying to get something here, but in this very, very edge case, there's actually not that much of a downside of at least giving it a try and seeing if we can get there. Okay, so we're pretty close. We just happen to be a couple of points of damage off. We can get him within 2 attacks, and I think that's a good goal here. I think I'd actually like to take this attack before he plays anything at slow speed, because we want to save something like Hush for the ability to block elusives later. Okay, so he's got a couple of Hushes here. That's a pretty nasty counter to this deck, unfortunately. We don't actually have any real counterplay to Hush. We can, you know, take less preemptive buffs, but unfortunately, like, losing all the buffs is still going to be pretty awkward here, and usually, even if we buff after Hush, it's still not going to be enough if we can't win with our elusives. We do have the ability to, you know, Hush essentially maybe hurt his draw there. That's probably not going to necessarily do enough to be worth a card. Okay, so yeah, it looks like we're blown out by Hush here, unfortunately. And that's one of the awkwardnesses of this deck that I don't think there's really any getting around. Like, you can run a Spell Shield, but the thing is, because Hush creates a fleeting Hush in hand, even a Spell Shield doesn't really help against it, because all they'll do is pop it with Hush, and then it'll create another Hush, and then they'll Hush through your Spell Shield. In this case, we have to play towards, you know, a potential win condition. Let's try to go a little bit later and, you know, Guiding Touch, see if we can draw something that helps us out here. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to have enough damage at this point. We don't have enough resources to deal 20 from him, especially because he's got a lot more healing in hand. So I think we can just take a surrender at this point. There's really just going to be no way to win this game anymore through that. Alright, so that's obviously one of the flaws of this deck that is never going to really be able to be fixed with a build, because you can't really go for something like a Fizz deck with Hush. Basically, you're never going to be able to engineer a situation where you don't get blown out, but there's not actually like an incredible amount of Hush on ladder right now, so it's okay for the deck to fold to Hush. It's not a fundamental flaw of the deck, but it is something that's obviously going to keep a concept like this from being something like tier 1. That's fine though. We're still going to be able to get a lot of wins against, you know, decks that aren't running Hush. I think personally, like, this build is actually feeling quite good. One thing I would think about changing is, yeah, the Behold the Infinite and Guiding Touches. Okay, so basically at this point, you know, we're thinking, are these cards going to be worth it? I'm fairly happy with Guiding Touch. It's a nice cantrip, like, race card. There's nothing really wrong with it in this deck. I could see replacing it for more draw. Behold the Infinite in particular is just kind of overcosted for what it does. At 2 mana, you're just not getting value on this Invoke because it doesn't have a body as well. And you have pretty low odds on a vanilla Invoke of getting something like Written in the Stars. So what I'd like to see instead of Behold the Infinite is something that plays for a more diverse game plan in this case. I really like the approach of just having Golden Narwhal in this deck. We saw last game, basically, sometimes all you need is an elusive body, and that can be enough to help you win games without fizzes, right? Like, we actually had a pretty solid stance last game if the opponent didn't really have the ability to deal with elusive with Hush. Because if they play an elusive blocker, we can answer it. But if they don't have Hush, even if we don't draw Fizz, we actually could have had a real shot at winning just by punching with really, really big elusive. And because the deck it naturally has a lot of buffs, you know, the way to solve this is just by adding a couple of more elusives for the buffs to hit. Okay, so we queue into a They Who Endure deck. This is one of the strongest decks in the meta right now. We do have a couple of answers in the Spacey into Equinox or Hush. We have a few ways of like shutting down the They Who Endure with our silence. So let's go ahead and full mulligan for our Fizz, as is just kind of like the general game plan here, right? This is a deck that's kind of like knows that it's dependent on this pretty singular condition. So we've got the Fizz on turn 1, and we even have the warning shot to protect it while we're tapped out. Usually he plays like a Hapless or a Bark Beast here, which is kind of unfortunate because we do have to lose our attack, but that's okay. Alright, he's got Keeper on 2. If he's got Butcher, then that's looking pretty spooky. It's a pretty rough hand. Ooh, no Butcher. Interesting. So that means he's got a pretty bad hand. When they play Keeper on 2, that means their hand is either amazing or not that good. Because they're either about to follow it up with a Butcher, or it just means they don't have an Elise or really anything else like proactive on 2 that they would play. Like sometimes like Omen Hawk hands. Okay. So yeah, we're just going to let the Keeper through as always here. So we can finally start getting it in with our Fizz in a significant way, right? So we're just going to start by trying to cycle off our cards. Guiding Touches, I kind of wish we're like a third salvage in this case. That's just important to note. And it's a little bit early to use pick a card, but I actually don't mind just opening with a Warning Shot here, just because Warning Shot isn't going to do that much more than Enable Nightfall here, because we don't really need to be worried about having like the 0 mana dodge option. That would be much more the case against like Bilgewater or Ezreal decks, that style of thing, where we would really need to make sure we have an option for that. His deck doesn't really have great ways of interacting with our Fizz with spells, right? He has the 1 damage ping, but we can actually tap under a response just because the 1 damage ping doesn't really matter here. Fizz is at 2 health, and even without a spell, Fizz is protected right now. Okay, getting it in for 6 damage. A nice aggressive start. And the nice thing about Guiding Touch is it can basically help us race him down a little bit. So a lot of hands go Caretaker here, and Caretaker is a little nasty because it means we might not have a way to protect our Fizz from the saplings, right? So it could come down a little bit to, you know, what our option is. We could try to find something off of Pale Cascade. But overall, it does look like our Fizz is going to be dying here. I think that's actually okay, though. Like I said, in this matchup, it's not as important getting it off every single time. The big problem here is not the Fizz so much, but the damage that we're likely taking. Like, this is quite a bit of damage, and I think we kind of have to be okay with it. Like, there's not really anything we can do about it. He is just playing, like, the aggro start. They Who Endure is a really, really strong deck, just with all these, like, aggressive starts. Like, the Callista's leveling here, and we can't really do anything about that. Because, like, even he had, like, not an ideal hand, but it's still very, very scary. So we're going to let our Fizz die, and we kind of have to be okay with that. Our objective here is to basically put him on a clock of 2, right? He's going to attack here on turn 4. And he's going to attack again on turn 6. And our objective is to survive his turn 6 attack and kill him on turn 7. He'll play his They Who Endure probably on turn 7 if he's got it. So yeah, that's going to be what we're going to do. Now, as you can see, it might be a little hard to survive one more attack, but we've got some heals and we'll play some blockers by then. So it won't be as hard as it looks. Not easy. So a really important thing about the game is just thinking in terms of timing or clock, right? You always want to be thinking, okay, how soon can we kill him? How many attacks do we need to survive? How many attacks do they need to survive, right? So we can go ahead and start with a Guiding Touch here, probably. We could also open with Mentor of the Stones. He's not really going to have good reactability. Yeah, let's open with Mentor of the Stones. We can Guiding Touch after this. We can open attack with this and try to get some chip damage in, potentially. It's more likely that, again, since we need to survive one more attack, it's more likely that we'll be forced to use Mentor as a blocker, though. We'll see. So we can go ahead and Guiding Touch our Nexus here. Pocket Aces is actually a pretty alright pickup. And Golden Narwhal, I think, is solid here. We're not going to be able to buff it because it is vulnerable, but that's fine. So if he has the 1 damage drain, he should probably try to go on the Shadestalker now before we attack with the Mentor. Unless he's worried about, you know, getting beaten out by a combat trick, which reasonably he should be pretty worried about. Okay, so we're getting in quite a bit of damage here, and Mentor is potentially tricky to block depending on like who he decides to block with. We have a good chance of either like keeping Mentor alive or denying him like one very relevant attacker. Okay, so we've successfully put him to the clock of 2. Now the tricky part is going to be actually surviving his next attack, right? Which we have a few ways of doing, especially off of our Guiding Touch. Yeah, this feels pretty cozy. It's going to be tight, like I say, you know, and there's a very good deck, so we don't expect to necessarily be able to beat a good hand on their part. I have Rose and Sentry. That's something we can deal with. It's not too scary. I think the big thing is to just make sure that, yeah, we have the ability to beat down his open attacks. And stuff like Guiding Touch, healing is going to be a really big part of that. So let's just open up with the... we're going to open up with a pick a card here. Try to find something a little bit better. The scary thing is his open attack, and we will have a bit of cycle for this, but we'd love to find, honestly, for example, something like 3rd Guiding Touch here would be great. Keeper's not too scary, all things considered. Oh, look at that. We did actually find 3rd Guiding Touch. That's pretty funny. Okay, so we do have the blocker to Callista, which is really, really important here. We do need to keep at least one of our elusives alive to try to end the game with. Okay, so he goes Keeper into Narwhal. I think that's fine. I'm basically forced into this to stay alive. But the Narwhal has the ability to close out the game, if nothing else. So at this point, I can basically just Guiding Touch my Nexus twice. And we're fairly safe, except to, you know, a lot of hands that have stuff like Atrocity. We're stopping the maximum damage off of blocking the Callista. This is stopping a total of 7 damage. So there's really no other block we can consider here to even have a chance of surviving. Alright, most Endure versions aren't running Fury of the North anymore, so they don't really have the reach on the combat trick, but he might have Atrocity, and that would be nasty. So we don't really have the ability to beat Atrocity, and at 2 mana, we can't, you know, bluff any sort of way around it either. What we do want is the ability to open attack for a win, so that he can't play, you know, he doesn't have the ability to play any action, except for Atrocity. Man, he's got it. That's kind of sad. We actually had a bit of a chance there. Atrocity's usually like, you know, something like a 2 of in that deck, so they don't always have it. This was actually pretty close. So overall, as we can see, the deck is doing better. Unfortunately, we are playing in Masters with a deck that is fundamentally not meant to be like super competitive. So as you can see, we are doing better, but unfortunately unable to pick up wins. Maybe for the Deck Doctor segment, I should play in like normals or something like that. And maybe I'll kind of like judge it depending on the deck I happen to be going with. But yeah, this is a fairly non-competitive concept. But overall, we've touched this up quite a bit. It feels a lot better now than when we started. As we can see, like we actually were very close to a closeout there. Like the Golden Narwhal helped quite a bit. Early aggression is a big thing we struggle with, like for example that, you know, Cursed Keeper style aggression. So I'd be very, very happy as a closing touch to this deck, fitting in a couple of Make It Rains. It's not going to do well against like every sort of aggressive strategy, but just as a way to delay out like many forms of this aggro, I think is going to be really, really premium. In this case, we can choose whether to get out of Golden Narwhal or Guiding Touch. I actually don't like Guiding Touch too much here. It's nice for its ability to cycle, but without the heal potential, it's not as good. I know that seems kind of weird because Guiding Touch like sort of almost helped us get back into that game, but when you're that far behind, you would rather have killed their units earlier and saved yourself quite a bit more health, right? We can actually run maybe 1 Guiding Touch instead of the 3rd Narwhal because we don't need that many elusives. And the deck at this point is fairly complete. It's about as good as this concept is going to be getting. All right. Well, it was kind of fun, you know, running through this deck and trying to hash it out. I love this idea of kind of doing the weekly segment, trying to get, you know, new deck ideas. I'm reading all of the things that you guys send me and like the comments on that tweet that I made. So it's I saw a lot of very, very interesting things to say the least. Anyway, that's going to be it for me, and I'll see you guys next time.